The air inside the bank was cool and still, held in place by the constant hum of the air conditioning and the quiet, serious business of money. It was a place of hushed tones and polished surfaces, where the floor gleamed so brightly you could see the distorted reflection of the fluorescent lights overhead. A long line of people snaked back from the counters, a silent, shifting chain of individuals lost in their own worlds. Some stared at their phones, their faces lit up by a private glow. Others looked straight ahead, their expressions blank, their minds already on the next item on their to-do list. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of papers, the soft beep of a machine scanning a check, and the occasional, muffled cough that broke the silence like a tiny firecracker. It was a place designed for efficiency, not for comfort. At the very front of this human chain stood a small figure who seemed to be out of place in this modern, fast-moving world. She was an old woman, her frame so slight that she looked like a gentle breeze might knock her over. She wore a heavy wool coat, even though it was warm inside, its buttons done up all the way to her chin. Her hands, gnarled with age and spotted with the faint map of a long life, gripped the strap of a worn leather purse with a determination that seemed to be her only defense against the intimidating environment. Her face was a soft landscape of wrinkles, each line telling a story of laughter or worry, and her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, were wide with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had been practicing this moment in her head all morning. She needed to withdraw a specific amount of money to pay for a new heater, as the old one had finally given up and the cold was seeping into her bones more than it used to. She had her bank card, she had her ID, and she had the number written down on a small piece of paper. She had checked and rechecked a dozen times. The young man behind the counter couldn't have been much older than 25. He had a neat haircut, a crisp shirt, and a name tag that was angled just so. He moved with a practiced speed, his fingers dancing across the keyboard, his smile a fixed, professional curve that never quite reached his eyes. He was good at his job, which in his world meant processing people as quickly and accurately as possible. He was on his third customer of the hour, and he was right on schedule. When the old woman finally stepped up to his station, he gave her the standard, "Good morning, how can I help you today?" It was a phrase he had said hundreds, maybe thousands of times. She leaned in a little, her voice soft and a little shaky. "Good morning," she began, her accent carrying the hint of a life lived far from this city. "I would like to take out some money, please." She carefully placed her card on the counter, sliding it toward him with both hands, as if it were a precious offering. The teller took it, his movements swift and automatic. He swiped it, turned to his screen, and then turned back to her. "And your PIN, please?" he asked, his tone already shifting to one of mild impatience. This was the moment she had been dreading. Her mind, usually so clear with the number she had memorized, suddenly went blank. It was the pressure, the bright lights, the young man's expectant stare. "Oh," she whispered, her cheeks flushing a pale pink. "Just one moment." She fumbled with her purse, her trembling fingers making the simple task of opening the clasp seem monumental. The teller let out a barely audible sigh, a tiny puff of air that was filled with frustration. He started tapping his pen on the counter, a rapid, staccato beat that seemed to echo in the sudden silence around them. A few people in the line behind her shifted their weight, their impatience a palpable force that pushed against her small back. She could feel their eyes on her, a silent judgment that made her hands shake even more. She finally found a small, folded piece of paper in her wallet, but her hands were trembling so much she couldn't unfold it. The numbers swam in front of her eyes. Further back in the line, almost blending into the background, stood a man in a simple, dark hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was just another person waiting his turn, his body language relaxed and unassuming. He had been watching the scene unfold, not with judgment, but with a quiet, growing sense of concern. He saw the teller's posture change from professional to rigid. He saw the old woman's shoulders slump in defeat. He saw the way her hands trembled, not just with age, but with a deep, humiliating panic. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the cruelty of the situation was impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was a quiet, soul-crushing indifference, a complete lack of empathy that was somehow even more painful. The man in the hoodie stopped thinking about his own errands. His focus narrowed, his entire attention now fixed on the small, lonely figure at the counter who was being slowly crushed by the weight of a world that had no time for her. The small folded piece of paper felt like a lead weight in her trembling fingers. Her mind, which had been so clear just moments before, was now a thick fog, and the numbers she had written down with such care were just meaningless squiggles. The young teller's sigh wasn't just a sound. It was a wave of hot air that washed over her, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of annoyance. She could feel the sweat beading on her upper lip, trapped beneath the heavy wool of her coat. Every second that ticked by on the large digital clock on the wall felt like an accusation. She was a problem. She was a delay. She was an inconvenience. The teller's patience, which had been paper-thin to begin with, finally tore. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a loud stage whisper that was somehow worse than a shout. It was a voice meant to be heard, a voice designed to shame. "Ma'am," he said, his words clipped and sharp, "we have a long line. Do you have the number or not? I can't stand here all day." He didn't look at her as he spoke. He looked past her at the growing queue of people, as if to silently apologize to them for her existence. His pen, which had been tapping a frantic rhythm, now stopped, and he held it poised over a void stamp, a clear and silent threat. The effect on the crowd was immediate and palpable. It was as if the teller's impatience was a contagious disease. The people behind her, who had been a collection of individuals, now merged into a single grumbling entity. A man in a business suit let out an exaggerated, world-weary sigh. A woman with a child in a stroller started rocking it back and forth with a sharp, agitated motion. Someone else cleared their throat, a loud, pointed sound that cut through the bank's quiet hum. The air, once just cool, now felt cold and hostile. The old woman could feel their collective impatience like a physical pressure against her back, pushing her forward, pushing her down. Her cheeks burned with a shame so deep it felt like a fire. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the polished floor and be gone. She had faced many hardships in her long life, war, loss, poverty, but none of it had ever felt as crushing as this public humiliation. She finally managed to unfold the paper, her fumbling fingers nearly tearing it in two. She held it up, her hand shaking so badly the numbers danced. It's here," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to read it out, but her throat was tight and no sound would come. She just pushed the paper toward the teller, a desperate, silent plea. He snatched it from her, glanced at it, and then looked back at his screen with a roll of his eyes that was so theatrical it was almost insulting. He typed the numbers in with forceful jabs of his fingers. The computer let out a soft, negative beep. The teller let out a groan of pure frustration. "That's the wrong pin," he announced, his voice now at its full volume, echoing in the sterile space. "It's been declined. We can't try again, or the card will be locked out." He slid the card and the useless piece of paper back across the counter toward her. They stopped just short of her hands, a small, sad island in the middle of the vast, polished surface. This was it. The final, crushing blow. The old woman stared at the card, her vision blurring with tears she was fighting to hold back. She felt a familiar, hollow ache in her chest, the same feeling she had when her husband had passed away, a feeling of being utterly alone in the world. All her practicing, all her preparation had led to this moment of complete and total failure. She couldn't even do this simple thing for herself. She was a burden, just as she had always feared she would become. The teller, seeing her frozen state, delivered the final, cruel line. "Look, ma'am," he said, his tone now flat and devoid of any pretense of politeness. "You're holding everyone up? Why don't you go home, find your information, and come back another time? Maybe when it's less busy." He gestured vaguely toward the line, a dismissive wave of his hand that seemed to say, "See what you've caused?" The woman's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her completely. The light in her eyes, which had been dimming for the past few minutes, was now extinguished. She nodded slowly, a small, defeated movement. She reached out a shaking hand to retrieve her card and the little piece of paper, her humiliation now absolute. She was ready to turn and walk away, to leave this place of cold efficiency and even colder hearts, and go back to her cold little apartment. Further back in the line, the man in the hoodie had been watching the entire scene unfold with a growing sense of disbelief and then a quiet, burning anger. He saw the teller's dismissiveness, the crowd's impatience, and most of all he saw the profound, soul-crushing defeat in the old woman's posture. He had felt his own patience wear thin, not with her, but with the people who were supposed to be helping her. He had seen her small, hopeful attempt at independence be systematically dismantled by a system, and a person that had no room for human error or human feeling. When the teller made his final, curt remark, something inside the man shifted. It was no longer enough to just be a witness. He saw the woman turn to leave, her head bowed, and he knew he couldn't let her walk out of that bank feeling so small, so broken. The quiet observer in the back of the line was gone, replaced by a man who knew with absolute certainty that he had to do something. He took a deep breath, pushed back the hood of his sweatshirt slightly, and took a single, deliberate step out of the line. The single step the man took out of the line seemed to suck all the sound out of the bank. It wasn't a loud or aggressive movement, but it carried a weight that immediately commanded attention. The murmuring of the impatient crowd didn't just fade. It vanished, as if a switch had been flipped. Every head, every pair of eyes, turned from the defeated old woman to this new, unexpected player in the drama. He didn't walk with the hurried, anxious energy of the other customers. His steps were slow, measured, and deliberate. The soft scuff of his sneakers on the polished floor was the only sound in the sudden heavy silence. He moved with a quiet purpose, a calm certainty that was a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had been swirling around the counter just moments before. The young teller, who had been so full of authority, was caught off guard. He watched the man approach, his professional smirk faltering, replaced by a look of confusion and then a flicker of annoyance. He straightened his tie, a small, defensive gesture, as if to reinforce his own importance. "Sir, you need to stay in line," he said, his voice trying to regain its earlier sharpness, but it came out sounding a little weak, a little unsure. The man ignored him for a second, his gaze fixed on the old woman who was now frozen mid-turn, her hand still hovering over her card. He came to a stop, not in front of the teller, but beside her, creating a gentle human shield. He positioned his body so that she was no longer directly facing the teller's judgment. He was now the buffer, the mediator. Only then did he turn his attention to the young man behind the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. He simply looked at the teller, his expression calm and steady, and spoke in a low, even tone that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice quiet but clear as a bell. "And I think we're all getting a little worked up. Why don't we just take a breath and start again?" The teller was speechless for a moment. No one had ever spoken to him like that. It wasn't insubordinate, but it completely dismantled his position of power. He opened his mouth to say something about bank policy or private transactions, but the man held up a hand, not in a commanding way, but in a just-a-moment gesture that was impossible to argue with. Then the man did something that changed everything. He turned completely away from the teller and gave his full attention to the old woman. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. He saw the tears welling in her eyes, the deep lines of humiliation etched around her mouth, and the tremble that ran through her entire body. His own expression softened, all the quiet firmness melting into a look of pure, simple kindness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle, reassuring murmur, "don't you worry about a thing. It's okay. These things happen. We'll figure it out." The old woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For the first time that morning, someone wasn't looking at her with impatience or annoyance. They were looking at her with empathy. It was so unexpected, so disarming, that a small, choked sob escaped her lips. She quickly covered her mouth with her hand, embarrassed by the sound. The man just shook his head slightly. No, don't be sorry," he said softly. "There's nothing to be sorry for." He then gestured to her purse. "Is it okay if I help you look?" Sometimes a second pair of eyes helps. He waited for her to nod, a small, almost imperceptible dip of her chin, before he gently took the worn leather bag from her trembling hands. He didn't just grab it. He supported it from underneath, as if it were something precious. He held the purse open for her, creating a private space between them. "Let's just take our time," he said, his voice a soothing balm on her raw nerves. "There's no rush now. The whole world can wait a few minutes." He wasn't talking to her but to the entire bank, a quiet declaration that their frantic pace was not the most important thing. The crowd, which had been a mob of impatient strangers just moments before, was now a silent, captive audience. They watched, not with judgment, but with a dawning sense of their own complicity in her humiliation. The man in the hoodie was holding up a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw. He helped her sort through the contents of her purse. There were old receipts, a few loose coins, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. He treated each item with respect. "What about this?" he'd ask, holding up a small notebook. "Or maybe in here." He spoke to her as an equal, as a partner in this small, important mission. The teller watched, his jaw tight, his earlier confidence completely gone. He had been outmaneuvered not by aggression, but by a profound and uncheckable decency. Finally, tucked into a side pocket she hadn't checked, was another small piece of paper, this one folded into a tiny square. The old woman's eyes lit up with a spark of recognition. "Oh," she whispered. I think that might be it." The man helped her unfold it. On it, written in her own shaky handwriting, was a 4-digit number. "Okay," he said, his voice warm with encouragement. Let's try this one. But this time you do it. I'll just stand here so no one else can see." He turned his body slightly, creating a wall with his own frame, shielding her from the view of the teller and the people behind them. He gave her the space and the privacy she needed to regain a piece of her dignity. With a hand that was now much steadier, guided by the calm presence beside her, she reached for the keypad. Her finger, guided by a newfound steadiness, hovered over the first number. The bank was so quiet now that you could have heard a pin drop, let alone the soft press of a button on a keypad. The man beside her stood like a silent guardian, his body angled just so, creating a small, private island in the middle of the bustling bank. He wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at the people in the line, his calm gaze a silent command for them to be patient, to be human. The young teller, who had been the center of the storm just moments before, was now a peripheral figure. Watching with a look of grudging respect on his face, the old woman pressed the first button. A soft click. Then the second. Another click. The third and fourth followed in slow succession. Each sound was a tiny hammer blow against the wall of tension that had built up in the room. She finished and looked up at the man, her eyes asking a question she couldn't put into words. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Okay," he said softly. "Now just press enter." She took a deep breath and pushed the green button. For a second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The old woman's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. What if it was the wrong number again? What if the card was locked? What if this kind stranger's efforts had all been for nothing? The thought was too painful to bear. Then the machine whirred to life. It was a low, grinding sound, followed by a series of rhythmic clunks. It was the beautiful, unmistakable sound of success. A slot in the side of the machine opened, and a neat stack of bills began to slide out. The old woman let out a gasp, a small, choked sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Her eyes widened, and a tear she had been fighting for so long finally escaped and traced a slow, warm path down her wrinkled cheek. But this time it wasn't a tear of shame or humiliation. It was a tear of gratitude. The man didn't rush to grab the money. He waited until it was fully dispensed, then he carefully picked it up. He didn't just shove it at her. He counted it quickly, his eyes scanning the bills, and then he looked at her. "Is this the right amount?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, unable to speak, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle another sob. "Good," he said with a warm smile. He then took the cash and neatly folded it, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up a deposit envelope from the counter and slipped the money inside. "There we go," he murmured, as if to himself. "Safe and sound." He then held out the envelope to her, but he didn't let go until her own hand was steady enough to take it. He watched as she fumbled with the zipper on her purse, his presence a calming anchor in the sea of her emotions. He didn't offer to do it for her, but he waited patiently, giving her back the small piece of control she had lost. The entire bank was watching this quiet drama unfold. The line of people, which had been a source of so much pressure and anxiety, was now a portrait of silent reflection. The man in the business suit, who had sighed so dramatically, was now looking down at his polished shoes, a faint flush of shame on his cheeks. The woman with the stroller had stopped rocking it and was now looking at her child with a new tenderness, as if realizing what was truly important. The impatient energy had been replaced by a collective sense of awe. They were no longer just customers in a bank. They were witnesses to an act of profound kindness, and it was changing them one by one. Even the young teller was transformed. The rigid, defensive posture was gone. His shoulders were slumped, not in annoyance, but in what looked like exhaustion or regret. He watched the man help the old woman, and a flicker of something, maybe understanding, maybe guilt, crossed his face. When the transaction was complete, he didn't say next. He just stood there, behind his counter, a silent observer to the lesson he had just been taught. Once the envelope was safely zipped into her purse, the man didn't just walk away. He turned to the old woman and gave her his full attention. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a genuine concern that was so rare in a world of fleeting interactions that she looked up at him, her eyes still watery but now shining with a bright light. She nodded. Then she found her voice, though it was still thick with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, thank you. Thank you so much." He just shook his head, a small, humble gesture. It was nothing. Anyone would have done it, but they both knew that wasn't true. He had done something extraordinary, not with grand gestures, but with simple, quiet decency. He waited while she gathered her things. Making sure she had her card and her ID, he watched as she took a deep, steadying breath, the color returning to her cheeks. The humiliation was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity that had been there all along, just buried under a layer of fear and anxiety. He had simply helped her brush it off. "You know," he said, his tone casual and friendly, "it's getting colder out there. Do you have a long way to go to get home?" It wasn't a prying question. It was a simple, human question asked out of genuine care for another person's well-being. He wasn't just a problem solver who had fixed a transaction. He was a good person who was making sure another person was going to be okay. And in that moment, that simple act of caring was the most valuable thing in the entire bank. The old woman looked up at the man, his simple question hanging in the air between them. "Do you have a long way to go to get home?" It wasn't just a question. It was an anchor thrown into the stormy sea of her emotions. For the past hour, she had felt like a tiny boat tossed about by waves of indifference and impatience. Now, this stranger was offering her a safe harbor. She thought about her small apartment, a few blocks away, past a busy intersection and down a street where the sidewalks were often cracked and uneven. The thought of walking there alone, after the ordeal she had just been through, suddenly seemed daunting. It's not too far," she finally managed to say, her voice still a little shaky. "A few blocks." She didn't want to be a bother, not to this kind man who had already done so much. She was about to say that she would be fine, that she could manage on her own, but the words caught in her throat. She was tired, bone-tired, not just from the standing and the stress, but from the sheer weight of feeling so small and useless for so long. The man seemed to understand her hesitation without her having to explain it. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes and the way she gripped the strap of her purse, a white-knuckled grip that spoke volumes. "Well, let's not take any chances," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a command, but a statement of fact, as simple and as certain as the sun rising. "The city can be a tricky place. Let me walk you outside. At least to a good spot to catch a cab if you'd like." Before she could protest, he gently offered her his arm. It was a simple, old-fashioned gesture, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She hesitated for only a second before looping her own frail arm through his. His sleeve was rough, the fabric of a simple sweatshirt, but his arm was steady and strong beneath it. A feeling of safety, so profound and so unfamiliar, washed over her. She leaned into him just a little, drawing strength from his solid presence. As they turned to leave, the entire bank seemed to hold its breath. The line of people, which had been a symbol of her failure, now parted for them like a sea. No one said a word. They just watched, their faces a mixture of awe, admiration, and a little bit of shame. The man in the business suit looked directly at the old woman and gave her a small, respectful nod. The woman with the stroller offered a gentle, encouraging smile. The atmosphere had been completely transformed. The cold, impersonal efficiency had been replaced by a warm, shared humanity, all because one person had decided to care. Even the young teller was changed. He stood behind his counter, his rigid posture gone. As they walked past, he looked at the old woman, and for the first time, he saw her not as a problem, but as a person. He saw the wrinkles around her eyes and the gray hairs escaping from her bun, and he saw a life that had been long and full, a life that deserved respect. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. It was a completely different voice from the one he had used earlier. It was the voice of a young man who had just learned a very important lesson. The man gave the teller a small, acknowledging nod, a silent sign that the past was forgiven. Then he guided the old woman toward the large glass doors of the bank. The automatic doors swooshed open, and they stepped out into the noise and chaos of the city. The air was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the stuffy warmth of the bank. It smelled of exhaust fumes and street food and the damp, earthy scent of impending winter. The sound of traffic, car horns, and 1,000 overlapping conversations was a sudden assault on the senses. The old woman flinched, pulling her thin coat tighter around her. The city, which she had navigated for decades, suddenly seemed overwhelming and hostile. But the man beside her was a rock in the rushing river. He didn't rush her. He matched his pace to hers, his arm a steady anchor. "Easy does it," he said softly, as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. He guided her around a puddle, his other hand hovering near her back, ready to catch her if she stumbled. They walked in silence for a while, a comfortable, companionable silence. She didn't feel the need to fill it with chatter. She was content to just feel the solidness of his arm and the quiet strength of his presence. She looked up at his face, partially hidden by the shadow of his baseball cap. He was just looking straight ahead, his expression calm and focused, as if walking an old woman a few blocks was the most important thing he had to do all day. "You are a very good man," she said. Her voice barely audible above the city's roar. He glanced down at her. A flicker of surprise in his eyes, as if he didn't hear that very often. "We just look out for each other, that's all," he said, his voice simple and matter-of-fact. "That's how it's supposed to work." They reached the corner where she usually turned to go home. The crosswalk signal was red, and a crowd of people was gathering, waiting to surge across the street. This was where she would have been on her own. "This is my turn," she said, a hint of reluctance in her voice. He stopped and faced her, gently turning her toward him. "Are you sure you're okay from here?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time that day. It was a beautiful, transformative thing, lighting up her entire face. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I am. Thank to you." She squeezed his arm, a small gesture of immense gratitude. He smiled back, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You take care of yourself," he said. Then he gave her arm one last pat, let go, and turned. He didn't wait for her to cross the street. He didn't watch to make sure she was safe. He just pulled his baseball cap down a little lower, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and walked away, melting back into the anonymous flow of people on the sidewalk. He was just a man in a hoodie again, his good deed done. Seeking no reward or recognition, the old woman watched him go until he was just another face in the crowd. Then she turned and faced the crosswalk. The light turned green and the crowd surged forward, but she stood her ground, feeling a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her coat. She clutched her purse, which held not just the money for her new heater, but something far more valuable, a renewed faith in the kindness of strangers. She took a deep breath, the cold air no longer biting but crisp and clean. She felt taller, stronger, more visible than she had in years. She was no longer an old woman who was a burden. She was a woman who had been seen and helped and treated with dignity. And as she finally stepped off the curb and walked toward her home, she knew that she would never forget the man in the hoodie and the quiet, powerful way he had taken control and reminded everyone what it means to be human.